Hey, what's good, people? I'm going to show you today how to self-contain your macro settings and macro automation within a Renoise instrument. So you can do things like this. With just the press of one key without any automation being held in a sequence at all. So to begin, we'll just start out with a new instrument. And I'm just going to load up a saw wave from our handy dandy Adventure Kids Waveforms folder, Perfect Waves folder. If you need waveforms, I highly recommend you check out Adventure Kids stuff. It's available for free or for donation. And it's very, very useful if you're doing any kind of single cycle sample-based synthesis. So I just loaded in our saw wave. I'm not going to be concerned about the key here. If I was, I would bring these down each by -2 because that'll put us into tune with the key of C, right, as they come out of the box, as it were. There's 600 samples even, which puts you at D2 plus 2 cents. So if you bring it down -2 and bring this down -2, then that puts you exactly at C. And that can be useful to know if you're using these waveforms, because then everything you do will be in tune with your VSTs, presuming that they are in tune as well. So let's go over to our modulation tab, and we'll set up, just for the sake of demonstration, a bandpass filter. And what we'd like to do is to modulate this, the rate of oscillation. We're going to put an LFO in here. And what we want to do is modulate this rate of oscillation, this frequency, right? Right? It's nice if we can change that, or change anything for that matter. This technique applies to any parameter that you can tie to a macro, which is, there are a multitude of them. I find this technique to be most useful for parameters that you can't otherwise control, say, for instance, effect parameters in the instrument effects chain. This is most useful for parameters within the modulation section of your instrument. So we're going to tie our macro to our frequency, as we've already done. And we could do this in automation if we set a node in here and go over to our automation tab, and we need to insert our instrument macros here, and then go to our automation tab. We can map this here. Right? And then if we wanted that to happen every time it was pressed, we could simply copy over this automation, or we could set up a key tracker to an LFO to control it. And that's essentially what we have done internal to the instrument itself. So we're going to delete this. The automation is removed automatically. We can leave that here. That way we can just press space and it will play for us. Going back to our modulation tab, we've got frequency tied to our LFO. And let's say we want to just do a clean sweep from high frequency to low frequency. Excuse me. I just ate breakfast. What we're going to do is we'll bring a Doofer in, and this Doofer has the instrument macros within it already. And it also has a set of key trackers and LFOs. And each key tracker controls the reset function on a given LFO. So this key tracker controls the reset on this LFO. And what the reset does is it determines the start position through the cycle of the LFO waveform, including the custom waveform, which can be any shape that you desire. And there are just a number of them to correspond to each individual macro. So to achieve the effect that we were looking for before, where we have this kind of clean sweep from a high frequency to a low frequency on the LFO, the filter LFO, what we will do is we'll go to custom and we'll set our curve, our modulation curve that we want to be tied to each key press. And we're going to bring the amplitude up and we'll tie it to macro 1. Actually, it's already tied to macro 1. I forgot that. And right now you can see the frequency value is set to infinite lines per cycle. So that basically means that it's at a standstill. So it's never going to leave this 0 position. And as you can see, as I play different pitches, our reset value shifts. That's because our destination values for reset span the entire reset range, right? So we have from 0 to 255. Now you can use that creatively if you want, but in this instance, we don't want to do that. We want to bring this all the way down to 0 so that every time a key is pressed, the key tracker will send a reset signal to this LFO at position 0, right? So every time it will start at 0. But because of this infinite LPC, we're not getting any movement on here. So we need to input a value for this. And I'm going to just go with 64 lines per cycle. And you can see that it's drifting on its own. And it resets every 64 lines. That's all well and good if you want that to be the effect, but say we don't. We'll transition this to one shot. And what one shot does is at the very end of the cycle, it just stays at that final position, final value. So then when we press our key, and we can see it in the macro here, we have a smooth and consistent ramping down of our macro value, and that corresponds to our LFO frequency, which updates visually in the modulation tab. I'm going to bring the amplitude down on this a little bit. And we'll bring the resonance up. And let's put a volume envelope here. And let's actually just do this with decay. Change that to 16 beats. Change my scaling a little bit, and I'm going to just add a touch of attack. Okay. So we got a nice little effect here. Let's maybe make it a little more interesting by cutting out some of these low frequencies. So we'll go over to our effects chain, and I'm just going to shift this so it's out of the way of our audio processing. Because this macro control Doofer, it doesn't need to be in an audio chain. And it can kind of clutter up your effects chain if you are using internal effects. So I always like to move it out of the way if I can. And let's just bring a digital filter, high pass it, and let's go to our Butterworth 8N so we have a nice clean cut. I'm going to bring in another Doofer here that I've set up for a ping pong delay. And we have ourselves a nice little one-off effect. I think I'm actually going to take the ping pong off. It's not really adding a lot. Maybe some reverb or something would be more appropriate. But in any case, you get the idea. You can use this for any macro that you want to control. And it's also very useful. Well, obviously, it's very useful in sound design. This is all sound design. But it's useful for creating random variation within sounds as well. So say, for instance, I wanted to, let's say I wanted to randomly vary this start frequency. I could tie our input to another macro, go into our macro controller, scroll over to macro 2, and the way I have these set up by default is that with every key press, we get a new random value. And you can dial in the range if you want it to be constrained. I want it to stay around the center, but still have some variation. So I'll set the amplitude to less than 50% and keep the offset the same. This infinite lines per cycle still works for us because we're not trying to modulate this this macro at all, aside from the initial state with each key press. So we just have it on our sample and hold random waveform. Frequency stays to infinite lines per cycle. The key tracker, well, that was a mistake. The key tracker on this one is set from 0 to 255, but that doesn't really matter. It doesn't make a difference with this random waveform. You can set it to 0. You can set it to whatever range you want to scale with the pitches on the keyboard. But it's always going to output a new random value with this sample and hold waveform. Okay. So perhaps you can see the potential here. There's all kinds of things that you can control. Let's maybe get into a different example. Let's bring in some white noise. And we're just going to cut this white noise down to a little snippet. And we'll take looping off, just so we have a nice little click. And I'm going to fade that out a little bit, just so we have a nice little tap. And let's just get right into our effects. Let's set up a multi-tap delay here. And we'll turn the feedback up. Let's change our delay value to just 10 milliseconds so we get something within audio range. Okay. We'll attenuate it a little bit. Okay, and we have ourselves a nice little tone. Let's tie our macro 1 to our delay values, and let's keep our minimum at 10 milliseconds. 10 milliseconds. And let's say 100 milliseconds for our maximum value. I'm choosing these values more or less arbitrarily, just to illustrate that we have something worth listening to, perhaps, depending on your taste. I'm going to turn up our feedback so we have a longer decay tail. It won't make too much of a difference because we have our filter frequency acting as kind of its own envelope. You can see it does impact it somewhat. So that's a little high. Let's go for 96. Let's try 96. It was a great year if you were alive then. I'm fucking old. So I want a little more range here. I'm actually going to go all the way down to 1 millisecond. And we'll keep that at 100 so we can transition more. So we have ourselves a nice little Karplus-Strong synth here. Let's attenuate our starting waveform a little bit more. I'm going to just keep fading that. Cool. Okay, now let's insert our Doofer, our macro control Doofer, which again I have saved as a preset. And I will make that available on Gumroad by donation if you'd like to download this Doofer and use it in your own productions, or you can, simply make your own. But if that feels a little daunting, you're welcome to download this one on my Gumroad, and I'll put the link in the description below. And let's just turn this up. Right? So we have a new random value every time we press. I would like this to be restricted closer to the audio range. That sounds good to me. That initial click is not quite doing it for me. I want it tighter. Yeah. Okay. And now we can work with this however we want. I'm going to throw a little compression on there. Bump it up a little. So another great thing about this is we could, say for instance, modulate some other value simultaneous. So let's change our feedback. So let's change it between, say 90%, and 99%. Because we still want those high feedback values to give us some resonance. And all we have to do is go back into our macro control Doofer, find our LFO2, which is tied to macro 2, dial up the amount. And that'll give us some variation in our kind of decay time for this. Honestly, that's not that noticeable. I'm going to dial this down some. Anyway, you can do whatever you want. I hope this illustrates the general principle. Again, if you want this macro control Doofer, check out my Gumroad. The link is in the description below. If you want to support me or just are curious, you can check out my music, zensphere.bandcamp.com. I hope this was useful for you. Go and make lots of music. All right, thanks a lot. Peace.